I'd like to welcome everyone today to our webinar on economics of heat stress, the implications for management. Dr. Albert DeVries will be our speaker today. He is an associate professor in the Department of Animal Sciences at the University of Florida. He grew up on a dairy and swine farm in the central part of the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands he received both his BS and master's degree in animal science with a minor in agricultural economics. In 1995, he came to the United States, where he started his PhD in animal sciences at the University of Minnesota with a focus on dairy science, applied economics, operations research, and statistics. After he graduated in 2001, he accepted a faculty position at the University of Florida, where he is today. He teaches 2 undergraduate dairy courses there and advises dairy students. His research interests are in the optimization of culling and replacement strategies, statistical process control, economics of reproduction, and precision dairy farming. In his extension role, he works with allied industry and dairy producers on farm financial management and to apply the results of his research interests. Without much ado, Albert, we welcome you today to give our webinar.
Okay, Donna, thank you for the introduction. And so I'll be talking about the economics of heat stress, and this is part of a USDA grant that we received to look especially at how can we improve fertility in dairy heat stress cattle. So I will basically talk about 3 topics this morning here. A little bit about the cost of heat stress nationally, and a little bit about the value of cooling. The majority of the talk will be about the value of improved fertility in the summer, and also during the winter actually. And in the end, I will talk a little bit about the use of sex semen and see if that's affected by heat stress in the summer or not. So I want to get started with some data from Norman St. Pierre from The Ohio State University. And he looked at dairy heat stress losses in the USA. And he read the literature intensively and built equations on how heat stress affects feed intake, which goes down under heat stress, milk production, which is also reduced during heat stress. Reproduction is worse during the summer. And as a result of cows not getting pregnant, there is some increased reproductive culling. And he also included the increase of death rate in the summer as well. And so when he calculated, he had a big spreadsheet, and he calculated the average losses due to heat stress in the U.S., and that is without any heat abatement. He calculated that at $167 per cow per year. And this is across all 50 states, and I think he weighted by the amount of cows in each state as well. So this includes all the cows in the upper Midwest, for example, as well, where there's a lot of cows and not much heat stress. And so in the South, it's clearly greater, as we will see here shortly on the next slide. He also then looked at 4 different kinds of heat abatement systems: non-heat abatement, a moderate, a high, and an intensive heat abatement system. And he calculated for each state what, given the cost of these abatement systems and how strongly they cool cows, what the optimal heat abatement system was. And he still calculated that if we invest the optimum amount of heat abatement, we're still at $100 per cow per year. Clearly, we could have no effects of heat stress on cows if we invest intensely in heat abatement, but the cost would be too great. So with the economically optimal heat abatement system, clearly there are still some losses. And so I put some data together here for 6 different states. Wisconsin as a reference, and then California, New Mexico, Arizona, Florida, and Texas. And the first column there, we look at the losses or the reductions in dry matter intake as a result of heat stress. And Norman St. Pierre, he had a model where he calculated the amount of heat stress, obviously, for each state. And then even for Wisconsin, he calculated a reduction of about 200 pounds per cow per year. And then if you go down the list, you get to Florida and Texas, we have about 2,000 pounds less feed intake per cow per year because cows that are heat stressed eat less. Now, these cows also make less milk. And so starting from Wisconsin, 403 pounds less per cow per year, all the way to about more than 4,000 pounds per year. Okay, and these I have to say all without minimum heat abatement. You can see in the days open column that the more heat stress we have, as in Florida and Texas and Arizona, the more days we lose per year. We increase our repro culling rate in the column over, up to about 8% for Florida and Texas. Death rate increases. And then the annual hours of heat stress. So consider that there's all hours in a year, both winter and summer, daytime and nighttime. He calculated how many hours are above, I think, a temperature humidity index of about 72. And you get to the southern states, like Florida and Texas, about half our time, if we did not cool cows, our cows would be under heat stress. And then if you look at the total losses that he calculated, okay, from dry matter intake, which obviously is less feed cost, which is a good thing, but less milk, more days open, more culling, more dead losses. If we did not have any heat abatement, he calculated $72 for Wisconsin, up to about $700 for Florida and Texas. Now, I don't have it on the slide here, but he also calculated the optimal type of heat abatement on each of these states. And he calculated that for every state that he had, including Wisconsin and the 5 below there, that at least high heat abatement, which is fans and sprinklers, would be optimal for dairy cows. And for Texas, he calculated intensive heat abatement, which is evaporative cooling, to be optimal. So it cools a little bit more expensive, but for all these states, again, high heat abatement at least, or even more intensive, would be optimal. He also calculated this for calves, 1-year-old calves, and pregnant heifers. And at that time, he did not think heat abatement was valuable. But there is some new data from the University of Florida where we can clearly show that cows that are cooled during the dry period produce quite a bit more milk, several pounds, 5 to 10 pounds more milk when they are lactating. Okay, so cooling dry cows, this is Jeff Dahl's research, clearly makes a lot more milk in the following lactation as well. And Jeff Dahl believes this also applies to pregnant heifers. So if you cool pregnant heifers, you potentially see these cows, once they calve for the first time, produce 5 to 10 pounds per day more milk as well. So if that's true, then clearly increased heat abatement for dairy heifers that are pregnant would be worth it as well. So let's move on then to the next item here and talk about the reproduction. Okay, and I'll start with some data Carlos Risco and I put together a while ago, and you can see pregnancy rate over time here. See, I can draw that. This would be the summer pregnancy rate here, and then here you can see the winter pregnancy rate for Florida, and for one you see a decrease in about the 25 years we've plotted here, but also a big difference between our winter preg rates and our summer preg rates. Okay, and of course there's variations in cooling systems here, some well-cooled dairies and some dairies that are not well-cooled. So clearly big differences here. Now, we ask our Florida producers, how important is it to get cows pregnant in the summer? And maybe if you remember that typically when we talk about the marginal value of improving pregnancy rate, that is a bigger number when pregnancy rate is low. We usually say, well, if the preg rate is, say, 13% and you go to 14%, maybe that's worth $30 per cow per year. But if your preg rate is already good, say 25%, you go to 26, then that's worth a lot less. Okay, so given that preg rates in the summer are low, you would think, hey, it's really important to get these cows pregnant in the summer. But if you talk to producers like in Florida, and actually we found out other places in the nation where we have quite a bit of heat stress, then our producers have somewhat seasonal herds, okay, where we have a lot of calvings in the fall, and then these cows, we try to get pregnant in the winter when it's cooler, when conception rates are higher, when these cows are peaking in milk, and that means they go dry in the summer. And these producers tell us, well, they prefer not to have any calving in the late spring or summer, especially those with not too much schooling. Okay, because that means if they calve in the late spring and summer, and basically it gets hot here late in April, I would say, early May, we really see quite a bit of heat stress developing. Then these cows would be under heat stress when they calve, which means the death risk increases, both for cows, also for the calves that are born at that time. We know that milk production is decreased, and milk production is actually more decreased by heat stress when the cow would produce a lot of milk. So if a cow peaks in the summer, you probably likely see more losses due to heat stress than when she is a low producing late in lactation cow. And fertility is lower, okay, which causes these cows not to get pregnant in the summer. So if we then are successful in getting cows pregnant in the summer, that means that 9 months later, all these cows calve in the late spring and in the summer, which is just what our producers tell us is something they do not like to see, especially if they have seasonal herds and they cannot control their heat. They don't have much heat abatement. So then the question is, how important really is it to get cows pregnant in the summer? And that's what I will explore here. So first, we'll do some generic evaluations here, and actually we use a big spreadsheet that I put together because there is no real data that I'm aware of that specifically said let's improve our fertility or conception rates in the summer, and then see what the advantages in profitability are. Okay, and so when we evaluate getting cows pregnant in the summer, we really have to consider calving patterns, which is actually not that straightforward. So I've been putting a big spreadsheet together because we really are looking at a systems approach. We can't just simply look at when the cow gets pregnant. We also have to consider then when she calves, what her lactation curves look like, what are culling rates, and also when these calves are being born, that if they're being born early in the spring or late in the spring and we start raising them and it takes us 2 years for these female heifers to calve themselves, hey, that means they would also calve in the late spring and summer. Okay, so collectively, ideally we look at all these consequences of getting cows pregnant in the summer. So I have this spreadsheet, and it has both young stock and cows. It has lactation curves, fertility, feed intake, labor prices, everything that has a realistic effect on cash flows for cows, regardless what time of the year. And then I can actually, I look at replacement of cows, what's the optimal time of culling some of these cows, insemination decisions, for example, maybe delayed breeding, as we will see, and also calf raising. We could decide from which cows or heifers to keep the calves. And then if we have a closed herd, which is one scenario, I would sell my surplus heifer calves, but keep the remainder of my calves, and I would sell all my bull calves. Okay? And then we're really interested in optimizing the profit for that herd, if you will. That's per cow per year, or sometimes per milking cow per year, as we will see. And then clearly we have all kinds of equations as far as the effect of heat stress on milk production, fertility, and death risk. Okay, so spend a bit of time to put all of that together. And then the scenarios I will show you are for Orlando, Florida. It doesn't really matter what that is at the moment. But you can see that in the summer we have heat stress here in Florida. Okay, so assume again that we have a herd with some realistic amounts of heat stress in the summer year after year. So if I put that together, these are some of the results of this model that I have there. See if I can move my arrow away. Yeah. So you can see here, this is my, actually at the beginning here, this is January. At the end here is December, in the middle of the summer. And you can see we have a seasonal herd here. Okay, where in the fall we have more cows calved. That's the red line on top. And in the early in the winter here, in the late winter as well, but late spring and the summer, fewer cows would be calving. Okay, I have to tell you too that the constraint here is that I have a fixed number of cows per year, 1,300. Doesn't really matter how many, but I can milk, or I have 1,300 milking cows, total cows. That is both milking and dry cows. Okay. In the blue line at the bottom here, that would be when my heifers calf that I have in my herd, and I also have the heifer calves that are born then. How many do I keep versus those are born? In this scenario, I'll basically keep all the calves compared to those that are born. So the spreadsheet basically tells me, okay, with the data I put in, I do still have a seasonal herd because of the heat stress, and with this type of the total cows constraint. Now on this next slide, a few more statistics. The black line on top, that's my total cows present there. So basically the barn is full as far as total cows go. But if I look at my number of milking cows, that's my blue line here. You can see I have most of my cows would be milking in the late spring here. And when I get to later summer, early fall, I have quite a few dry cows. The difference between the black and the blue would be my dry cows. When you look at the milk production per cow, that's even more seasonal, and that's because in this late spring I have a lot of cows that are in milk, so that helps. And also these cows, because they calf during the winter mostly, they're around peak production. So more cows, and also at that time they produce more milk. And at the bottom here, this is my percent open cow, so that changes over time as well. And I could have another, I could have, there's no heifers in here, but the heifers are seasonal as well, obviously. So let's quickly look then at the generic scenario where I have a technology that increases my probability of conception by 10%. Okay? And so if my conception rate for a certain cow, a certain time of the year is 40%, and I improve that by 10%, then it becomes 44%. Okay, that's my scenario. And if we look at this slide at the bottom here, for example, for the heifers, this is an input here at the bottom. The conception rate goes from the red line here, the bottom here, to the blue, so 10% increase. And for the cows too, I go from the blue to the green, 10% increase in conception rate. Okay, so in this scenario, yes, there was a little higher conception rate bump, absolutely, in the winter than in the summer, and we could have done that differently, perhaps. But you could see that, of course, still there is a drop in conception rates as inputs for the cows and the heifers in the summer. And then this technology being available gives me about $39 per slop. That is actually per total cow per year an advantage. Okay, so but it has some consequences for the calving pattern. For example, if we look at the number of inseminations here, then I go for my cows, from my blue lines to my green line. Okay, and clearly the green line is usually lower than the blue line because the higher conception rate means fewer inseminations. This is inseminations per week for this herd. And so in the winter here, I actually have more inseminations. So this herd, as far as breeding goes, is even more seasonal. I breed fewer cows, even with this better technology in the summer, and I have more inseminations in the winter here. Okay, if you look at the heifers, that's the pattern is not very clear, especially here this late spring. You would have fewer breedings in the heifers, and later in the fall you would have some more breedings for the heifers. So maybe this is already contrary to what you might believe, okay, that even though the conception rate was low, we do not really want to breed more cows when my constraint is total cows in the summer here. And so I looked at delayed inseminations as well. Now, this spreadsheet that I have can look at delayed inseminations, okay? For the heifers, that means if I do not breed a heifer, I have another opportunity, I believe, 4 weeks later. And for the cows, if I skip an insemination, that means the next one is 5 weeks later here. But you can see that this is percent of the breedings. For the heifers, up to about 30% of the breeding opportunities would be delayed. And I think usually that might be the first breeding opportunities for virgin heifers. Okay, and that's mostly in the spring here. For the cows, the late breeding then would happen more in the late summer to the fall here. And actually, if I increase my conception rate, I actually have even a little bit more delayed breeding in the summer. And that's because these cows that I do not breed here, I have more of these open cows towards the fall when I breed them. And again, that all has to do with scheduling my calving pattern, and at the same time considering that there may be, for these cows that conceive later, they will be longer in the current lactation, lower milk production. For the heifers, for example, I think there's about $2 cost of raising. So clearly the age of first calving for these heifers increases as well. But collectively, that seems still be worth doing. Okay, and so a little bit about calving pattern again, then again with the increased conception rate that I have. And you can see that I have more calvings actually in the fall and almost fewer in the summer there. So a little bit more seasonal herd when this is my constraint, the total cow constraint. Now quickly, let's look at another constraint. People tell me, no, really your constraint is the milking cows. That's what you try to keep your parlor full, for example. And there's always ample space to keep the additional dry cows. So the question then is, okay, if my constraint on my dairy changes, does this affect my economics? Now my constraint is 1,000 cow milking cows. I mean, the 1,000 doesn't matter, but it's milking cows that's my constraint, which is the thin blue line is my constraint. And according to the spreadsheet, I would basically be full most of the time of the year, but around here, maybe August, September, I would not be completely full as far as milking cows go. I'd be milking 900 something cows. And you can see the difference here between the total cow actually number changes over time. Okay, a little fewer total cows here than here because I have more dry cows. And about the same pattern in milk produced. And you can see that compared to the previous slide that my open cows curve changes a little bit as well. Now, when this is the constraint, this technology is worth $60 per slot per year. So already the constraint now has an effect on what the value of getting cows pregnant in the summer is. If I look then at my number of inseminations, you can see with the increased conception rate, it's a lot more even than it used to be. And actually, we would not breed fewer cows in the summer, but about the same. And because we need fewer inseminations because the conception rate is higher, we actually have fewer breedings early in the winter here. Okay, and for the heifers, you don't see a real clear pattern, I would say. So clearly an effect of the constraint here. A little bit more here, very quickly here. This is the slack in the parlor. 1,000 would be full or in my barn, and where I increase this higher conception rate that I have more of the time am I at almost milking 1,000 cows. And this is the total number of cows that I have. So everything from 1,000, the difference here would be my dry cows. Okay, so my calving or my pattern changes some. As far as delayed breedings goes, also somewhat different from when our total cows was the constraint. And I would actually delay more heifers in the spring and early summer. Okay, for the cows, where I used to have some delayed breedings in the summer, I don't see that much anymore. Almost no delayed breeding for the cows if we have the lower conception rate technology. But with the increased conception rate technology, some delayed breeding now in the fall and also here in the spring. And the calving pattern changes as well, but you can see how that changes. Fewer calvings here, for example, for the cows, okay, in the fall. So, but let's move on. So, apply this to a real technology, and this is data from Todd Bilby and Pete Hansen and And Stewart was a student there at Texas A&M, and so this was in the journal Dairy Science, and they transferred in the summer sexed female in vitro fertilized embryos into cows, and they have almost double the conception rate of the AI group that they used as well. So about 200% of what you get with the AI conception rate. And again, 88% of them would be heifer calves because of the sexed semen. Now the question is, what are the economics? Okay, and we said it's realistic to be $90 per transfer, and compared to about $20 for AI breeding. That includes maybe some drugs as well on the AI breeding side. So 90 versus 20, but you have a higher conception rate. If the surplus heifer calves, we sell them again, $250, we sell all the bull calves, and of course this changes our calving pattern. And I have just two scenarios for you to show here. Here, look at the inputs, for example. This is on the conception rate. These 3 months in the summer, if we put an embryo in there, we get this green conception rate, okay, so about here. So double what we get with AI. And here the red is the inseminations or the embryo transfers in the summer. So it's complete embryo transfer to all cows in the summer. And the heifers were all AI in the summer, okay? The rest of the year will be just AI. And so our constraints are, there's no delayed breedings. We did not consider that here. We sell all calves. We purchase our heifers. So we're flexible as far as heifer purchase goes, and we have a total cows constraint. And when we do this math, then it's not quite valuable, not quite profitable to put embryos in these cows. There's a loss. I calculated a loss of $4 per milking cow per year. Okay, and that has to do again with if we get a lot of animals pregnant in the summer, they calve in the late spring here, and with the total cows constraint and no delayed breeding, and still the losses due to heat stress, it just did not pencil out, if you will. But we go to another scenario, which is actually quite a few changes here. We looked at the variety of things now. So first of all, we decided, well, some cows it's worth to put an embryo in, and others are better off with AI. So the spreadsheet tried to figure that out. And by stage of lactation, by parity, for example. And I also allowed delayed inseminations. Some animals, I said, okay, let's wait, not do anything. And that's during the year, not just those 3 months. And we have also our 1,000 milking cows constraint. Okay, so 3 things changed compared to the previous scenario. And now it's worth $88 per milking cow per year. Okay, so that's not just for those 40% of the animals that had, or 25% of the animals that had an insemination or an embryo input in them during the 3 months of the year, but that's for all cows. Okay, and so clearly we can break that down by, okay, what's the effect of figuring out the optimal breedings versus the late breedings and the constraint, which we have not done, but given all these flexibilities and this big constraint, there's a big advantage. I want to go back actually one slide quickly here. And this shows you here that there's still some blue line that's not at the bottom. That means at this time of the year, about half of the inseminations were with AI, and the other half were with embryos. So clearly, you would choose, or the spreadsheet would have to calculate for you which animals are better off putting embryo in and which one are better off with AI. Genetic value of calves, for example, has an effect on that. Okay. So very briefly here, before we wrap this up, we're also interested in these effects of seasonality on breeding mix. Clearly, putting an embryo in an animal versus AI is already a type of a breeding mix, an insemination mix decision. And then we could also put conventional sex semen in the mix, for example. Okay, so here I looked at just sex semen versus conventional, no embryos, and we have our summer heat stress model. And I have $20 for conventional semen, normal fertility, which depends a little bit on the cow, for example, stage of lactation and parity. But I get 48% heifer calves, and I sell my extra heifer calves again, and I keep the ones that I need to keep in order to be raised and replace my colt cows. And I sell my bull calves. And my female sex semen, there will be a $15 premium, and I actually take a little bit of a hit on my fertility. I only get 80% of my normal fertility, but I get more heifer calves, and I would sell the ones I don't need. Okay, and so the question is, what is the optimal mix? And I only have one slide here, just to show you that there is a seasonal effect, and this is my 1,000 cow milking cow constraint again. And if we look at the red here, that would be actually sex semen in cows, which I think, you know, is a possibility, is an option sometimes. And clearly, most time of the year, there's no sex semen in cows, but early in the fall here, we see some use of sex semen in the cows. Most of the time, as far as the number of inseminations goes per week, we have conventional AI. If we look at the heifers then, quite a bit of sex semen use in heifers, okay? And you can see that the purple versus the green, mostly during the summer here, but not this time of the year. You'd be better off putting regular AI in these heifers' semen and not sex, okay? If I have this scenario where we allow this model to optimize which animals get what kind of semen, then I capture about $37 per milking cow per year, versus a scenario where I have just conventional AI only. So that brings me to my last slide here. Although my evidence here was pretty briefly in this talk, it's generally calculated that cooling dairy cows pays in hot climate. Cooling is probably the #1 thing we can do under heat stress. And then, of course, when we look at the value of it just getting cows pregnant, well, if we're still under a lot of heat stress, that affects both repro, both milk, also milk production, survival of calves, etc., then clearly the value of improving fertility depends on these herd constraints quite a bit. Parlor capacity, but you can think about cash flow, for example, as another constraint as well. And then, of course, it has implications for the optimal insemination mix. That's both sex semen. And so really what we're interested in, given we have a certain amount of seasonality in the herd, and we have all kinds of breeding options, sex semen, we have conventional dairy semen, we have embryos, we maybe have beef semen if we do not need the calves, or we're interested in crossbreds. What is really the optimal mix for which kind of animal and in what type of season? Okay, so that's really the bottom line that we're looking at. So with that, if there's any feedback, I'd like to hear that, and that's the end of my formal presentation here. Donna?
Thank you very much, Albert. If you have any questions, please go ahead and type those in the chat box, and we'll go ahead and go through those with Albert. And we've got one question in there already, is how much would the genetic evaluation of females change your outcome of your model?
So in this current model, there is the regular genetic progress of females, and I don't know, is it like $50 net merit breeding value, I think, about per year? So the heifers are worth more than the first parity cows, and then you see that in the value of their calves as well. So clearly that's in there. If you talk about genetic evaluation, I mean the next thing, and I don't know if you're asking this, but the next thing is, you know, which animals should we do just some genomic testing on, for example? Okay, and so then the question becomes, one thing we're also interested in, if we can create a surplus of heifer calves and we do some genomic testing, and that means the testing allows us to make some more culling decisions as far as which animals to keep and delay. Clearly there would be a seasonal component to that as well, as far as when would we still want to keep many of these heifers and when would we have a surplus to sell them. And that's probably the best answer I can give you at this point.
As with all models, there's always different scenarios that you can look at and see what happens there. And Steve's question really relates to that, looking at different scenarios within there. Have you looked at trying to concentrate breeding into 2 seasons to sort of keep balanced year-round production, and looked at the economics of that?
I have not looked at that. That's a very interesting question. Clearly the model can do this, and I could, for example, So what the model showed, there is just one calving peak in the fall. Okay, it's so there's a dip in the summer, and then it's higher in the fall and the winter, and decreases in the spring again. I think that assumes you would put some constraints as far as when would you want to breed animals. For example, you may not, just say, okay, I do not want to breed certain animals during parts of the year. And so, the model would allow us, I think, to look into this question more, and it's sort of number 5 on the to-do list, okay? Because I'm interested in this in grazing type dairies as well. For example, where you want to evaluate grass growth with the calving pattern, okay? They collectively go together as well. And again, that's probably the best answer I can give Steve at this point.
Obviously, looking at those models, Albert, it seems like obviously this is the fuller you keep that barn, the better off you are.
Yeah. So yeah, it's funny. Traditionally, all the folks that do this modeling talked about the total cows being the constraint, which then if you increase, and if that's the case, and you increase fertility, that means you shorten the calving interval. Well, if you maintain a 2-month dry period, for example, total time a cow spends dry increases, and she spends fewer days in milk, which means if you have a total number of cows, your total number of milking cows decreases actually when you improve fertility, But then people try to educate me and tell me, no, milking cows is really the constraint. So then you have a cap on that, and your number of dry cows changes. Clearly, improving fertility, because you're not taking a hit on the number of milking cows, is more valuable when milking cows is a constraint than when total cows is a constraint. And that's been sort of an eye-opener for me. It sort of makes sense, but I don't think people really have looked into that much yet.
And one of the other things I saw from your models was that your strategy needs to be governed by the area that you live in. Obviously, heat stress in upper Midwest is a lot less.
Yeah.
A number of days is less. I'm not saying on a day it's not. It could be as high as other places, depending on the year and the weather, but they just don't have the length of time there. So really, your strategy that you use depends on the situation that you're in, and making sure you define what that is.
Right. Now, the modeling I've done, you could do this for, say, a Midwest situation, as long as you can predict which month or which 2 weeks of the year you have a heat wave. But in the Midwest, you probably don't know that. When I lived in Minnesota, I know it can get above the 90s, certain days. And so if you don't know which 2 weeks you have a heat wave during that year, it's probably a little bit more difficult to plan, okay? And I don't know what producers would do. When you have a very strong heat wave and you know it's going to be a week, maybe 2 weeks, are these producers doing something differently during that time, or are they just continuing their normal routine? At this point, I haven't really looked into that. The fact that normally there's not much heat stress, but you have a wave coming at you, you can predict this maybe 5 days in advance, and it lasts maybe a week. Are you doing something differently, or should you be doing something differently that week, reproduction-wise? And so that's still a question for me.
Well, I think one thing it does show is even in the upper Midwest, they have to look at ways of heat abatement.
Yeah.
It does affect feed intake. It does affect repro. You may not see it today. You may not see the long time frame, but it still does have an effect, and the effect on the dry cow.
Yes, and if you go back to the Norman St. Pierre's calculations, he calculated for all lower continental 48 states that at least high heat abatement, which means fans and sprinklers, was the optimal investment strategy.
And your model probably would show that those pay for themselves.
Right. That'd be optimal, because then the benefit is greater than the cost, and that's actually the optimal amount of investment, yes.
We have another question. Would monitoring core body temperature of animals in real time give you an increased predictability and efficiency in determining heat stress?
Monitoring body temperatures in real time, so you can see whether cows are in heat stress at that time. I don't know how to calculate the value of that. Obviously, that's a great way to really judge whether your cows are heat stressed or not. I think when it comes to my type of economics, I'm really interested in, how much milk do we lose, and what does that mean for feed intake? What does that mean for reproduction? So, I think if we were to have good relationships between body temperature and those losses, then I think it has value. Otherwise, if there's not a strong relationship, I personally don't know how to use that data, except to say that, hey, cows are heat stressed. Probably there's a problem on this dairy, and there's certain areas that probably heat abatement is valuable.
Well, if we have no more questions, I'd like to go ahead and thank Albert for doing this, and really appreciate his time. And with that, I thank you very much, Albert.
Thank you.